Well, hello, Jeremy. I'm good. I'm here in my home where I spend almost all my time now, except for brief trips out to grocery stores and other places that I'm allowed to go to. Whatever. How are you? Hmm. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, right. I guess that's sort of the way of it at the moment, although that's maybe changing here for better or for worse. I think we had enough. It's like we're done now. Damn the torpedoes. Let's see what happens, I guess. Oh, that must be confusing for people.
Now my voice is on the stream. I bet.
Yay!
I
Is
bet my
it?
voice is on the stream. They're going to tell me.
Well, there was
Someone is going
another
to tell
side
me.
to that conversation that I was having with you. You said all the good things that were amusing and fun.
So here we are. We're going to see. Yes, it's a fun learning curve. Learning to stream. Thank you, community, for telling me like I'm an idiot to my face, but on the messaging that in a kind way.
Yeah, it's
So
helpful to have a live audience. We did a version of this thing that we're doing right now a number of years ago that was just a podcast, and we always had to wait for a while to get feedback from it. So in the moment feedback, that's exciting.
it is, and I'm just pulling it up so I can get all these people's names.
Wow.
The
Put them on a list.
That's right. So Rob, tell us about you. Not everybody who's watching knows about
I
you.
suspect that almost nobody knows anything about it, which is fine. I wouldn't expect them to necessarily. I live in Louis, and I am a writer of various things, film, television, uh, and podcast called The Junto Presents, which I recommend to all of you out there. Jeremy and I know each other because we both met in the Mary Baldwin College, now University, uh, program in Shakespeare and Renaissance literature in performance, which I believe that the name of the program has changed from when we were there, but it was all about Shakespeare, and it was done in association with the American Shakespeare Center, the esteemed theater company in Stanton, Virginia, where we met and became friends and worked together on various things. And since then, I came out to Los Angeles to try and work in the entertainment industry and have to, varying degrees of success from time to time, depends on when you're asking. Um, and That's what I do with my time right now, in addition to occasional jobs to pay the bills while trying to do that. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I'm a professor of theater at Fayetteville State University, um, here in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We have not had, uh, I've not had to go into work for like 10 weeks. It's kind of been delightful. Uh, I do miss some students, and mostly like other human beings. Like I am an introvert, but like at a certain point, you know, there's a I don't know. It's nice to be able to sort of touch people. I don't
Yeah,
mean that
which
inappropriately.
I know, I know.
I
Uh, right. Let's all take as stipulated. You meant that in the least bad way possible. Um, yeah, it is. I'm similar to you. I mean, I think we both there's a term of professional term for that, describing the introvert, extrovert, the people who are introverted, except for, when they have a performance impulse that has to be fed, and suddenly they can get up and do all kinds of embarrassing things in front of people. I think I fall on that, in a similar place on that spectrum as well. But even I, socially maladroit as I can be from time to time, am ready to interact with other people. So
So here
maybe
we are.
this counts as something like that, I guess.
I guess.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we did this podcast many years ago called Shakes Pop. That was about Shakespeare and popular culture. And well, I was just going to say, I remember one of the episodes we did like a fantasy football draft of Shakespearean characters. I remember that fondly. And so,
yeah,
go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just saying, we're back. We're doing something. We're going to talk a little bit about Shakespeare, and probably a lot about all the other things that bother us in our lives,
right?
From politics,
or even things that we're enjoying,
yes,
right?
That's true. That's true.
It doesn't have to all be bad. This is sort of in spirit the same podcast, although with a looser format. That was a little bit more segment heavy, a little bit more organized, and lost the energy to do something quite that organized now. So we're going to talk about stuff with a general emphasis on popular culture and the news, and then we'll also talk about some specifically Shakespeare-related thing each episode, just to let you know how this is going to go. And maybe that'll change. We'll figure it out. You're in early days here, folks. But yeah, that's probably going to be our emphasis, right?
Yeah, sounds good.
So let us begin our conversation about what we're going to talk about.
So it's the Shakespeare piece of this is plagues.
Yeah, right. Which we may come to. We'll probably jump into that explicitly a little bit later on. But Jeremy, what one of the titles, which again we have not totally locked down on yet, that we considered for this is After Hours, in keeping with the Shakespeare, with the Sweet Tea Shakespeare naming convention for their online media. And you could imagine it as you've gone to see a show, and after that you decide to get a bite to eat or go to get drinks with friends, and a conversation ensues, and this could be something like that, right?
It could be.
It could be. And, talking about what's going on in your lives. And since we cannot go, at least not in my state, to restaurants or places to get drinks, this is the closest we can come to that. So, Jeremy, what have you been watching or consuming artistically or media?
I will say the thing of note, I'm committed to catching up on a lot of television while this is happening. And the thing of note I've been watching lately, I am all caught up, is Killing Eve. I've been watching a lot of Killing Eve. I should say that about 2 weeks ago, I convinced my bride to let me buy a new television because I was like, if I'm going to be stuck inside for months, I'm going to get a new and glorious television. And I did. It's 75 inches of high definition, and it's fantastic. And so Sandra Oh's face is like bigger than the top third of my body on the screen, and I have no complaints. You see all the detail of the actor's face as they're doing their thing, and it's truly delightful. So I've been watching a lot of Killing Eve. About a week and a half ago, I saw the Frankenstein, one of the Frankensteins, with Benedict Cumberbatch and
Danny
Johnny
Boyle.
Yeah. On the the National Theater, their weekly release. I did not see both versions. I saw the one where Johnny Lee Miller played the monster and Benedict Cumberbatch played Victor Frankenstein, and I enjoyed it. I have things to say about it. But those are the things I've been consuming, I think, mostly. Yeah, what about you?
I don't know. I've been watching a lot of TV recently. I've had a hard time locking into anything. Weirdly, like in this moment when you have this ocean of media there and a bit of extra time, um, I'm feeling like oddly unfocused, and it takes a lot for me to get really engaged in something. Something that I did watch recently was this new show on Netflix called The Midnight Gospel.
Mm.
It's an animated show from this comedian named Duncan Trussell, and and the guy who did Adventure Time. Did you ever see that show?
I did not.
It's great. It's this surrealistic sort of very funny kid show, and this is in that same spirit, but really more for not kids. And it's based, interestingly, off of a podcast that Duncan Trussell did, where he would bring interesting thinkers or people, with a specialized background, particularly in sort of philosophy or different sort of religious ideas, or that kind of thing. It was a very sort of let's dig into what it all means kind of podcast, and did many episodes of that. And then they took a few of the people who they had done episodes with and took like the audio from these sort of philosophical conversations that they had and animated over it, and then had those people come back and contribute some sort of interstitial like dialogue or little pieces to help facilitate these very strange narratives that are happening within it. Like it's like takes place on a different planet that's not Earth, or a different dimension. I don't know. It's loosely defined. And he has this sort of AI setup that he can pull up like fully realized universes and worlds on, and then stick his head into this machine that transports him down his consciousness and avatar body onto one of these planets, where he interviews people for his podcast who are in the middle of like weird adventures. Like one is this like sort of medieval warrior lady who's killing monsters and seems vaguely vampiric, and another one is an alternate version of Earth, where Dr. Drew from Love Lines and TV, I guess, is the president of the United States during a zombie apocalypse. And so while they're dealing with like fighting off monsters in medieval world or trying to run away from the zombies, it's in the middle of these sort of long philosophical discussions about life and the meaning of life and everything that's going on. And it creates a really interesting sort of mix of sort of lowbrow and kind of, sophomore dorm room discussions at 2 a.m. sort of thing. But it's great. I love it. And it's really funny. And I recommend it to all of you. If that's your thing. If it's not, you'll know pretty quickly. So that's
all right. It's on my list. It's on my list for tonight. Nan is my wife, for those of you who don't know. Nan and I rarely agree on television. She with just very different tastes, and we tend to leave each other alone. So I've been catching up because I basically, for I don't know, 3 or 4 years now, have home at any time. Like I've been in a constant state of rehearsal, so I'm using this quarantine time to catch up on everything possible. The last show I think we agreed on was The Americans. We agreed on that. That was fantastic, of course.
That was a good show.
She did last night sit with me for 2 or 3 episodes of Afterlife, Ricky Gervais's dramedy thing.
How do you like that show?
Okay, so I thought the first season was pretty great.
Uh-huh.
In terms of, he gets to do what he does, which is sort of insult people to their face, in character, and I don't know. It scratches my itch. It's something I wish I could do to a lot of people, and so there is some sort of emotional reward that comes from.
Vicarious wish
Yes.
fulfillment.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and all the characters are a little quirky and funny. The second season is working less for me. I think it's a little more strained, and um, it's the characters aren't going anywhere. There's not been a change, and there seemed to be like an arc last season, somewhat, and that it just kind of didn't know what to do this season, so they kind of reset and went back to it's just Ricky Gervais, in all these situations, sort of making fun of people and all of that, and it's sweet at times. It's very sweet, and I find the his sort of take on processing trauma to be authentic, but it isn't great. It's I mentioned strained. It has this inauthentic kind of thing about it that and repetitive thing about it that I could probably do without. So I will probably finish this season, and then I'm not sure I'd come back to it after this.
It's interesting. Ricky Gervais, I have a not simple reaction to him these days. With The Office, I thought which is what introduced me and everybody else to him who was first introduced to him. I thought was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, amazing piece of work. Funny and horrible and trending and dramatic and interesting, and I don't think I had responded as intensely to a piece of comedic sort of work as that at the time. I mean, it was great, and I really liked the other show that he did with Stephen Merchant as well, Extras, where he's playing extra in sort of the London film community. And I thought those were both really good. And then, as Ricky Gervais, the personality became more and more of a thing, I just found him harder and harder to take. I can often do a pretty good job of separating the art from the artist, but there is a point at which it becomes a problem for me. And there was a point at which I just found his persona and sort of his celebrity so unpalatable and difficult to take that I genuinely had a hard time clicking into it. And it's weird because at the same time I was listening to the Ricky Gervais podcast back when that was the only thing on the block. And I liked the stuff that honestly, you know what? Also, I think that there's a line of demarcation with him. When he stopped working with Stephen Merchant, I think that the work that they did together was better than the stuff that he does on his own. It's not like he isn't still interesting and funny, but the show that first sort of I don't know if I'm interested in this anymore was the one that he did just before this. I can't even remember the name of it. It's where he plays the guy who I don't even know how to describe him. Who is of lower intellectual status, though perhaps not. It's hard to say. If that is due to some condition or not. They leave it very ill-defined, but it had this sort of odd, cloying sweetness to it that didn't work for me in some ways. I don't know, when he reaches for emotion right now, I have a hard time with it. The stuff that is more sort of acidic, that feels more authentic and generally more funny, but his attempts to marry it with something, sweet and uplifting, quote unquote, I don't know. It doesn't work for me, especially perhaps in light of how nasty he is as a person. And I felt like it was more authentic when Stephen Merchant was helping him out with that. I feel like he had a better like together they had a better handle on what was authentic for that, and so it's just odd. I don't know. Ricky Gervais. I followed him on Twitter for a while, and then I had to stop because it was like I can't do it. I can't do it. It's like his constant sort of weird preening with his like demonstrative angry atheism. Not that, be an atheist, I have no problem with this, like, good, but like the constant it's like, I don't believe in God, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. And it's like, okay, I don't care. It's like, you, the stupid people with this stupid God telling me that I can't talk about how much I don't like God. And this is reality, mate. Just deal with it. It's like, shut up. I don't care. Oh.
I do. What I appreciate him when I appreciate him most is that ability to the sort of access the dark part of what everyone is thinking and say it out loud. I love that. And I love, and this is true about basically everything, is when he breaks, like when he's hosting the Golden Globes, or he's on a show and he's kind of dancing the line between sort of character and himself, and he does that a lot, probably by design, but I just really enjoy it. I think it works.
That is pretty effective. I came into his last hosting stint on the Golden Globes kind of a grumpy attitude about it. It's like, ugh, Ricky Gervais, and then he was legitimately funny in some moments. So I don't know. He's an interesting, complicated guy. But I haven't loved his shows recently. Although I have not actually watched the new one, so maybe I should give that a try.
So, what's bothering you these days?
I mean, good Lord, what isn't? I don't know. I find myself in these moments where I start getting into conversations about the president and everything that's happening, and then I like get off on these angry sort of rants, and I'm like, I'm boring myself. Just like as I'm talking about this, I sound super repetitive, but it's horrendous, and I don't know what the right response to it is. I mean, just to be clear, what I'm talking about, I'm not a fan of our president of the United States, and I feel, horrible about the way that everything is happening because he's the president, and how many times can you say that, right? And have it be an interesting piece of information to say, and it's like he does some other horrible thing, and it's and it's like, oh look, another horrible thing, and you can't talk about it without sounding like a crazy person after a while, or just a broken record, right? It's like, did you see the other horrible thing that Donald Trump did? Yeah, it was horrible. Oh man, I sure do hate that guy. And it's like, yeah, okay, so what? I don't know. It's disheartening and awful. The world, I don't know, and genuinely terrifying. I don't know what's bothering you.
I would say what's bothering me is the. I mean, it's the big umbrella is the coronavirus thing, but the I think if I had to drill down to the specific thing, it is. Something like, is this the best we can do? And it's tied into national politics and all that, but set that aside for a minute. But okay, so we've had this problem now for 5 months, globally 6 months. This is it. Like we have Amazon, we have Google, we have the private industry, who is sort of has capacity. I'm not saying those are like medical, biological.
No,
but like
right.
we this is the thing. a really, really bad cold is the thing that will like uh,
Yeah.
shut the place down for maybe 3 years or more.
Well, right.
And that
And
and so it's so that's been part of the thing, and the other part of the thing is really, really, what does management of this thing look like pre-vaccine? Like, it's fine that we're all sitting at home right now, but in 2 or 3 or 4 months, it's going to be different. Like, you could even extend it to the end of the summer. Like, we could like maybe things, attitudes, mentalities, lifestyles change for a big segment of the population from now to August anyway. But like, really, really, what is management of this going to look like? And no one has presented an answer in the sort of public sphere that I think even gets close to that. It's all prognostication about the worst case or the best case, and
right.
we're going to be shut down for 3 years or 2 years or whatever it is, and I'm like, that's not it. There's like, that's not it. And I hear the sort of chatter about test, contact trace, all of that, and that does not feel like the management that I'm talking about. Like society, what is society going to do over the next time period? And I guess I'm surprised at how few ideas we've come up with given the state of the emergency. Um,
Well,
does this make sense at all?
yes, it does. And honestly, I think that it comes down to a question of leadership to
Mm-hmm.
a certain degree. There are states that are having good responses to this, I feel like. But, you mentioned like those different companies and whatnot. They're not altruistic organizations. You know what I mean? They don't like Google and Facebook and whatnot. They have been able to accomplish impressive things, but that's not their job exactly. And you think back to something like World War II, where America was able to marshal sort of private industry to help deal with this massive crisis that we were going through. That requires strong leadership, strong centralized leadership. And regardless of how you feel about, the role of big government, quote unquote, in times of crisis, there tends to be a sort of general feeling that if the president of the United States tried to do something to help, deal with this in a massive effort, no one would be upset about it. You know what I mean? It's like, especially if they were effective. And part of what's frustrating to me about the way that the current administration is dealing with this is they're working very hard to not acknowledge the scope of the problem, because once the scope of the problem has been acknowledged, that has second order effects. Like, it's not great for the economy, and it ruins the narrative that the president needs in order to get reelected. And so there's this constant attempt to minimize what's happening as much as possible, because that's as opposed to sort of confronting it head on, right? And dealing with it in a forthright way. And so there's that, and then you couple that with the president's general sort of lack of interest in doing hard things. I mean, it would require sort of a monumental effort on the part of the people in charge to coordinate and do something. And some of that's temperamental, to the, I mean, to the conservative way of looking at the world. It's like, well, you don't want a strong government, but it's not really true. Like, in practice, you take a look, even whether you feel good about it or not, like George W. Bush after 9/11, like, they had a big sort of centralized response to that thing and made it a national project. Do you know what I mean? And there's been this intense effort not to allow that to happen here. It's just like, don't look at me, don't look at me, don't look at me, don't look to us for answers. There isn't a problem anyway, and everything's fine. And, the truth is, like, if you want to find an answer to this, it required somebody to be like, okay, this is a big problem. And now we're going to try and have a big response to it, right? And so that's going to involve us having to, I mean, contact tracing, maybe it's useful or not, but it's a piece of it. There are countries that are doing a lot here. And a recognition that, you could come up with a plan that did some stuff that would increase people's confidence more than anything. But that's not going to happen here, and I don't know what the answer is. You talk about like 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 years. People aren't going to wait until the end of the summer. They're not waiting now.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in what that is, because I mean, and I think you're right that there are specific examples of countries or communities that are solving this problem in different ways. But and I don't actually just mean this in terms of like what the average American or the American people at large can or cannot stomach. In terms of like whether they're going to go out, whether the economy is going to restart or whatever. It's just like the human, like, what is the new order going to look like? Regardless of, not regardless of, but like, let's say we have several more months of the current administration sort of continuing on the same path. Like, there are going to be others that take control, and I want to know what that looks like. Because ultimately, I think what we're going to I guess where my brain is going is that we're ultimately going to begin to make some decisions about how this society has to work while this disease is going on, and what is that gonna? What are the possibilities?
Well, this is the moment where we start to find some of that out, right? Mm-hmm. As things reopen a little bit here. And, we're making a bet as a nation, whether we want to or not. Some people want to. It's like, this isn't going to be as bad as everybody thinks it's going to be. Let's just get back to it. And even if it is bad, suck it up is the general message. And that's either going to take or it isn't. You know what I mean? It's like, we'll know in a few weeks, in about a month or two, if there's a big spike, right? If the reopening of this is working out okay and tons of people aren't dying and we can handle it, then good, right? That's the bet that we're making. Or that's not going to happen. And, things are going to get way worse and everyone's going to get sick again and they're going to have to go in. And whatever happens after that is what's going to define the longer term sort of prognosis for this. This is actually a good segue into our, Shakespeare discussion here about plague. I was reading a piece in the New Yorker that Greenblatt, famed Shakespearean scholar, wrote, talking about the plague during Shakespeare's time, mm-hmm. the reaction to that. And what was interesting is that during that period, the plague, just happened every few years, periodically. Like, every decade or so, there'd be an outbreak of plague, and sometimes for a number of years, it would just hamper things, and it was common enough that people just sort of got used to it as part of the regular sort of pattern of, it's like, after a period of years, oh, look, it's the plague again. And sometimes it'd be for a long time, sometimes it wouldn't be for very long. A little bit like winter in the Game of Thrones sort of books, in that it's like sooner or later winter is coming. We don't know how long it's going to be. In fact, I make a totally unfounded guess, but I would say that it's possible that George Martin actually was thinking about the plague in terms as the metaphor for the way that winter is. On that, it's like you go through a period of years where everything is nice and good, and then all of a sudden the plague comes, and everybody has a say inside, and life is terrible for a while. And it wreaks havoc, but it didn't wreak that much havoc. Like, weirdly, they understood how to deal with it, and the political and sort of social order was able to absorb that in a way that life just kind of kept on going. We don't have that capacity at the moment, but maybe it's something we'll develop. I don't know, but it's interesting.
Yeah, we've been dealing a lot at Sweet Tea about the sort of plague mentality, sort of taking it as a cue. When the plague um, sort of closed down the theaters in London a couple times. The legend, uh, is that these guys had to go make their money somewhere else, go out in the country and work there, um, or that's when Shakespeare started writing sonnets for his patron or whatever to bring some money in. And so that's kind of what, like, we're trying to think through that mentality, uh, noticing that the cue there is, I think, sort of a different kind of creative life or a different kind of output. You know, it's at a minimum, for a writer, maybe a period where you're sort of putting more in than producing things,
Mm-hmm.
or it's a period of incubation. That and that's interesting to me, and also at the same time, I mean, Sweet Tea and I are sort of in a privileged position where uh, we could sort of shut down the productions for a while and like sort of afford um, um, to sort of draw down the revenue, because our biggest expense is sort of paying artists when we do a show. So if we're not doing shows, we write off our biggest expense. There's we're in a position where that's sort of manageable, and at the same time, what that calls to everyone's attention, and this sort of speaks to our context, and I think how artists sort of live in our culture, sort of generally, is that um, those people are all sort of cast into the wind on unemployment rolls or whatever, and this is where I come back around to um, I uh, looking at Shakespeare and the early modern period. They had to sort of be inventive themselves in the way that contemporary folks are going to have to. But I can't help but think that the best solution is a big idea solution, like I don't know, universal basic income or something like that, that takes the pressure off all these small organizations and small businesses. I mean, you talk about this with regard to the restaurant industry or the retail industry as well, and just um, frees those artists up or those small entrepreneurs, um, and and kind of redistributes the pressure, I guess. So I'm thinking through those kinds of things at the moment.
Yeah. Well, it's either going to have to be a big idea like that, or we're all going to have to really fundamentally change the way that we think about people dying.
Mm.
And what's disturbing for me is that you can see an effort being made in certain quarters to really sort of get people uh, okay with that idea. It's like, some of you are just going to have to die so that I can get a hamburger. I mean, that's glib, but so that people just keep making money. And I understand, like, it's, but it's a weird sacrifice to ask people to make when it's just a weird way of having to change people's minds about things. Like, there are societies that are set up on an axis of, like, you know, you should expect to have to, sacrifice yourself for the good of the nation. But that has not been the way that we've been running things here for a long time. And also, like, with this gross sort of weird overlay of, the weak among you, you know, must die for the strong to move forward. And it has these sort of authoritarian Nazi-ish kind of, I mean, we're not supposed to talk about Nazis, I guess, but these authoritarian overtones that are weirdly anti-American in terms of the way that sort of we think about ourselves. You know what I mean? Or the way that the national identity has been historically. And it's weird to see that, maybe change. It's like, you know, it's just odd. And you think about it in contrast to, Shakespeare's era, the Elizabethan Jacobean era. That was a hard time to be alive, right? Uh, And obviously there wasn't centralized help from plagues really. Then, although that society was set up in such a way that, I mean, the entire thing was sort of state run. I mean, it's not terrible. You can't you can't really talk about it, but it also was like terrible. And it's like I don't know. There's a whole economic discussion that I'm not really qualified to weigh in on, so I'm not gonna do that here. But I, you know, I'm interested in what the sort of cultural response to this is going to be over time. One of the other things that Greenblatt points out in that New Yorker article, and it's like from last week, it's worth checking out, is that Shakespeare, interestingly, makes very few. He makes references to plague a lot, like it's in the language periodically as a metaphor, particularly like people talking about, oh, it's like the plague, or you can catch it like the plague, or stuff like that. But as far as representations of the plague itself, there are almost none in his plays, which I find very interesting. It's like, so you can reference it as a thing that people understand and know about, but he doesn't like make it a story point ever. And this has to do with the question of how in our society, like after this is passed, I don't know that. I think it will be surprising how little reference it and think about it afterwards, because people just don't like to talk about it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know I'm talking a lot,
No,
but
it's
like
good.
one thing, I'm working on a project right now that with some partners that has a sort of is in a sort of day after tomorrow kind of future, has science fiction elements to it, but is not is close enough to where we are that we could like reference this, or we have to grapple with it to some degree and keep coming down on this idea. I don't know if it's something that we need to talk about or should talk about explicitly, because people don't like. I mean, people are gonna get real sick of it. You can just feel like this instinctive sort of feeling like I'm not sure that people are going to be interested in hearing about this, or like artistic examinations of the plague right now. It's like there's just going to be like, that's okay, I lived that. It doesn't really have anything to tell me like right now. And I think it's fascinating that for a person who lived in a society where every 10 to 20 years there'd be a massive outbreak, we don't have a plague play, in Shakespeare's canon. I think that gives us some clues about what our response is going to be like to this culturally.
I do know. So, sort of an analog in Shakespeare world to with the theaters closed sort of in advance of the English Civil War, or as part of that whole narrative, in 1642, and didn't reopen until 1660. And in that there was a civil war in that period. And when the theaters reopened and came back, there was no taste for anything violent, and plays were sort of rewritten, resituated. Even Shakespeare plays were taken and sort of new endings put on them, expressly because the audience was sort of there to escape and laugh together, and did not want to deal with the heavy stuff. And so I certainly think there's a case that's gonna, or there's an argument that falls sort of in line with what you're saying. I do think the thing that I keep coming back to, and both in my own mind and in a conversation with other people, artistic directors, whoever, is that there's this sort of prolonged period of being locked up sort of begs the inevitability of a real kind of renaissance culturally uh, around the places and things where we gather. And I could see, so as an example of how my prophetic mind works here, is that should Major League Baseball come back in July, even if there are, well, assuming that there are no fans in the stands, those ratings are going to be uh, like monstrously huge. That's my prediction, because it's that kind of experience that people miss. It's that kind of thing that people want to have in common. I think the same thing will be true at some point for theaters, for live concerts, for things like that. I'm not saying it won't be gradual at first, like it could start small, but at some point, when the management has been figured out of how we're going to deal with this, and or a vaccine or something like that is in place, there will come a point where there is an explosion in the sort of cultural life and
Right.
And the sort of communal civic life of in-person activities.
I think that's right.
And I think that
Right.
goes everything from sports to arts to church to wherever. I think we're going to see a period of time, a number of years, where people sort of recognize that that's part of the identity they want to have.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And it's a strange thing to know that on the other side of this, there is this like explosion, like you talk about, that's likely to happen. If history's a guide, but knowing that you're not there yet is weirdly frustrating. And you can see that. I mean, what's striking to me about the way that people are reacting right now to, you know, being tired of staying at home and stuff. It's like, arguably it's had some, it's clearly had some effect, but it's unclear how long it needs to last still.
Mm-hmm.
But what's weird is that everybody just got tired of it. Like, it, I don't even know. Everybody's not the right thing. Like, there's this media perception, right, that everybody is tired of this, where in fact it's just some people are getting vocally more angry and they seem to be in a minority. But the way that this is trending right now, it's just like, all right, we're done with this. Seems to be the sort of general national response to it. It's like, yeah, this was fine. Now we're done. And it's like, on the basis of what?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this isn't over yet. Numbers are still going up in terms of people's infections, and this didn't stop spreading, and it's not going to. I mean, maybe it will. That's the thing. I don't see reason to think that it will. And so it's like everyone's like thinking of that thing you're talking about, which is like, there's going to be this big explosion, economic, cultural. It's all going to happen as soon as we all just get back out there because everybody wants it. But you can't get over the fact that it's like, yeah, but it's still there,
Yeah.
right?
And I think we're talking about in maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years is kind of where I see the sort of gold rush happening potentially.
What do you do for 2 or 3 or 4 years?
Yeah.
I mean, right? What do you do during that time? We're at the beginning of this thing,
Mm-hmm.
which is a horrific thing to contemplate. Like, that this is the beginning of a long process. I mean, we're all gonna. How many seasons of Saturday Night Live can you see that are Skyped to, America? How long? And the condition. I don't know. The long-term effects. Maybe there will be long-term effects on this. I mean, it's like if we spend 2 or 3 years like this, the economic devastation is going to be tremendous. And, who knows how this shapes people coming out of it. Like, we're talking with my wife, my wife Michelle, the other night about like people who were in the Depression, right? The Depression generation, like that made them weirdos for the rest of their lives. Like, people who, remember I was on study abroad trip in London where we had this like shared dining area, and one of the professor's wives was a very elderly woman who, was raised during the Depression, and after everyone was done eating, she like went to all the tables and picked up people's half-used butter pats and put them together, and added water to all the ketchup bottles that had like a quarter inch of ketchup left in them, and poured them all in together. And it's like that just it's not unreasonable behavior in the middle of a depression. It was not necessary at that moment, but like people are gonna, who knows what people are gonna carry with them for the rest of their lives after this.
Yeah, I think, well, you're of course talking about trauma, and I think that's going to play out over many years. I also think we're seeing, a lot of the stress strikes me as it's a very American problem, but like their people's identities are so tied up in work, and and you're seeing a sort of grief and anger of like people wanting to return to jobs that like on the whole they did not love and were not good to them, and so I'm
But it's also because they need to
it's
they
also
need to
because
eat.
right you have to and that's what I'm interested in seeing, if the seeing whether there and what kind of shift there is where it is not necessarily about what you contribute to the economic engine that sort of gives you self worth. I mean, there's capital, there's value in it. Don't get me wrong; you're paid to do a job or whatever. But like, I also think we have tied our self worth to it, and that's a different kind of value proposition. And so I'm interested to see. Okay, now that we have this sort of rift where you have to sort of be at home with your family if you've got one, dealing with yourself without distractions in the same way that you would have had in a sort of workaholic mode, and you get to experience that discovery. Then what happens when you go back to the sort of regular economic life? Are you
Well,
bringing with it like a different sense of self worth? Are you valuing things differently in any sense? And I'm not saying, people are still going to need to eat. They're still going to need to have jobs. Just all of that's going to be the same. But I just wonder if our minds are going to be computing that thing differently.
maybe. I mean, it also seems like there could be this interesting um, unwanted effect of right now. It's like push everybody to go back to work, right?
Mm.
And if it works out, the way they're hoping it does, uh, and there's minimal disruption to, or acceptable disruption as far as people are concerned, it's like the loss of life is not so disturbing that people are willing to accept it, then I don't know if it is going to make much of a difference. But one of the weird unintended consequences of like saying we're not going to offer you sort of assistance economically anymore, so you have to go back to work, and deal with the consequences of this. If it turns out to be really bad, it could actually backfire along the lines that you're talking about, which is to say, like, people could really come to resent their work, right? I mean, one of the things that has made America's economic system work and capitalism writ large, it works best when people aren't really thinking about it that much. When it's unacknowledged, and what's dangerous at this particular moment is that dangerous to people who care about the sort of American capitalist system continuing on, and the idea of what you were talking about, like the idea of people taking their self-value and their worth from the job that they do and their position on that. Like, you put people into, when you're drawing explicit attention to, you must do this for the sake of our capitalist system, you must go to work now for that, you run the risk of making people resent it and decide this isn't important to me. I don't care enough about my job doing X, Y, or Z to make this worth it. Or that, feeling of, I have to go do this job that I already, as you said, didn't love in the first place, but gave me some value, some feeling of self-worth, and helped put food on my children's table. It's like, now you're telling me, like, I have to do this because, if I don't, we're all going to, I don't know. It just changes the calculus. And that weirdly could shepherd in, like, make it much more easy for people to be like, I'm done with this. Like, the American capitalist system doesn't work for me anymore. I quit. And, all of this, like, effort to sort of push everybody back in right now that's happening at the federal level and in certain states, it, like, could end up making everybody be like, screw this, I'll be a socialist now. Right? In greater numbers than has already happened. It's interesting.
All right, what else you got, man?
I don't know. Nothing.
All right, I have to decide what to watch this week.
There's a show on Amazon that's kind of interesting called Uploaded, or Upload. It's got the sort of odd bad luck of following The Good Place, which is a riff on similar themes about it's an afterlife show, but it's about people. It's like Black Mirror meets The Good Place, essentially. This guy's like, you follow this one person whose consciousness has been uploaded into this vast computer system. It's like a heaven of sorts. But it also turns out to be kind of miserable for all sorts of reasons that are mostly economic. But it's a clever, sort of fun show, and it has a much sort of darker, cynical core to it than The Good Place did, as a riff on sort of those ideas. It's worth checking out. It's pretty good. It's fun.
Good. What do you got going on this week?
Well, I'm working on a couple of different writing projects that I'm going to be pushing forward on, working on a comic book with writing part, as well as developing a long in gestation television project that is slowly moving forward and hopefully moving forward more quickly. And once that does, I can maybe talk about that more. But doing that, helping my kids with school, which is a whole other thing. Ugh, we could talk about that on another occasion. That's a long discussion to have. And that's sort of taking up my life right now.
Good. Well, this is my first real week off contract at Fayetteville State, which is exciting. I'm going to have a couple meetings, and I'm teaching over the summer, but that's just a couple weeks away. So I've got some time. I'm going to do as little as possible and de-Zoom,
Yeah.
Try to Zoom detox. Everybody wishes they could do it. College professors. I mean, I became a professor, I always say, because I love the schedule. And so it was worth going into tens of thousands of dollars of debt, because I do have large windows of my schedule that are open. And this is a good time of year for that. So I'm going to detox a bit and watch a different kind of screen.
Yay! Yeah. Hooray for screens.
Yes,
they mediate everything we do now.
Yes, indeed. All right, man. Well, I just wanted to tell everybody listening, if you have things to say to us, maybe you want us to talk about something next week that we didn't. If you have questions about anything we've talked about or whatever, you just want to reach out, review us skewer us, whatever you want to do. The email address for doing so is ours, HOURS, at sweetteashakespeare.com. We'll get that. If your question is great or your criticism is astute, we will put it on the show. And also, if you want us to keep doing this, you need to visit this link up here. It's called patreon.com/sweetteashakes. You can make a monthly pledge starting at about $5. Lots of perks, behind the scenes podcasts, all kinds of other things. It helps keep the lights on. So anyway, good to see you, man.
Yeah, good to see you too.
All right, I'll see you in a few days.
Yeah, we'll talk some more later.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.